Well, good morning. Most of these devotionals that we've been offering have been predominantly pastoral in nature, but I want to encourage you to brace yourselves this morning because I'm going to push on you a little bit, and I want to talk to you a little bit about God's call on your life. We're going to be focusing on one little verse in Paul's letter to the Philippians. It's Philippians 2:13, where Paul writes this: "For it is God who works in you to will and to act according to his good purpose." Now, as I've mentioned, I'm sure before, I've been teaching a spiritual gifts class, and we wrapped up about a week ago. And one of the things that I love about teaching is that nothing helps you to understand a topic like trying to teach it to others. I often find that it's one thing, I'll think that I know something very well, but then you can go and stand up in front of a classroom of students and all of a sudden they begin to ask questions, and you realize that there's just so much more to know. And that's often the case, and certainly has been the case with this teaching on spiritual gifts. I feel like I've learned something every time we've offered the class. And in this most recent offering, I've learned something that I want to share to you all in terms of our calling. Now, we've been using a 6-session course entitled Network that was put out by Willow Creek some years ago. And it's a 6-session course, and session 5 is entitled The Influence of Passion. Now, the basic premise of the chapter is this: the Bible teaches us that God loved the world. John 3:16. God loves the whole world. He loves all of it. And he cares about every need in the world. I mean, not even the sparrow, the needs of the sparrow, escapes the loving gaze of God. But you and I, we don't have the capacity, nor do we have the resources to care about every need in the world. Our hearts and our pocketbooks just aren't that big. That's the reality. So God, in his wisdom, he's placed a little piece of his heart into each of his children. That part of God's heart, for example, that cares for children, he may have placed in your heart. Or that part of God's heart that cares about the hungry, he may have placed into your heart. Or that part of God's heart that cares for young mothers who are in crisis, again, he may have placed into your heart. And this is why you care about some things more intensely than others. It's why different people care about different things. It's part of God's design so that the needs of the world can be met. Now, this little piece of God's heart that he places into each of our hearts, it's what the Network course refers to as our ministry passion. Now, I have to confess that I really don't like that term very much, ministry passion, simply because I don't consider myself to be a particularly passionate person. So I would prefer to refer to this, what God does in terms of placing his piece of his heart to our hearts. I would call that a sense of calling. Now, for some of us, this sense of calling might be to right or wrong. It might be to meet a need. It might be to try to solve some kind of problem, or to serve a cause, or to change a life. This is what Paul is talking about in that verse in Philippians. For it is God who works in you to will and to act according to his good purpose. Now, this passion or sense of calling, it can show up in all sorts of ways. For some, it can show up in very positive ways. We can feel energized about our sense of calling. We can feel excited and inspired. But it's equally true that our sense of calling can show up through some pretty unpleasant feelings. It can show up as anger about something. It can show up as a sense of burden or a sense of heartbreak about some need that's going unmet in the world. And when that happens, when our calling shows up as one of those negative feelings, it can feel a little bit like a hot potato in our hearts that we want to pass on because we don't like those feelings. They're not very good feelings. But more often than not, those negative feelings are actually God's way of moving us into action to respond to those needs. They're part of God's design. And yet sometimes what I've come to learn is that God's design, this plan of his to put a little piece of his heart into our hearts, sometimes that can get short-circuited in the church. And that has been my eureka moment in this past offering of the spiritual gifts class. And here's how it happens. When I was just starting out as an ordained minister, people would come to me with these feelings that we're talking about, these negative feelings, heartbreak, burden, anger. And they would say something along the lines of, the church has got to do something about fill in the blank. Now, given the infinite needs of the world, you can just imagine that there are an infinite number of items that you could put into that fill in the blank. Now, most clergymen by nature, most clergymen want to be helpful. And most parishioners who find themselves with this hot potato of God's calling burning a hole in their hearts, they're glad to pass that hot potato along. And so what can happen when an inexperienced clergyman is confronted by a distraught parishioner and his hot potato is that we can end up with a clergyman who is holding a bag full of hot potatoes while the needs of the world continue to go completely unmet. It's taken me 17 years of work in the church to discover that sometimes the phrase, the church has got to do something about this, really means I want to hand this hot potato over to the clergy, to the vestry, to the staff. And when that happens, my friends, everybody loses. The church loses because the clergyman is not able to fulfill his calling to teach, preach, pray, lead, and pastor because he's holding that big old sack full of everybody's hot potatoes. The parishioner who's passed along his hot potato loses because they never experienced the rich joy of stepping out in faith to serve God by answering that call that God has placed on their hearts. And of course, most of all, the needy lose out because the very people whom God has called to serve them have dropped off their hot potato and gone on with their lives. But friends, this is not how God designed the church to work. Again, as Paul put it, for it is God who works in you to will and to act according to his good purpose. Every Christian has a responsibility to discern his calling from God and to minister to meet that need. Now, of course, the church does have a role to play. Of course it does. The clergy are called to equip the saints for this ministry that we're talking about, the ministry that God has placed in their hearts. So we have an equipping role through our teaching and preaching. And as the community of God, the church can help us to find others who share our same passion so that we can partner in ministry. After all, Jesus sent the disciples out 2 by 2, and that's how Christian ministry is often best done, in partnership with other Christians who share our same sense of calling or ministry passion. And the church can also provide counseling and guidance and prayer as we seek to discern what our calling would look like in the world, especially as we seek to live that out in whatever season of life we're in. For example, if you're the parent of 5 children under the age of 12, answering your calling is going to look a whole lot different than when your children have gone off to college and have moved out of the house. So the church can be there to help us discern what does that actually look like. The church has a role in supporting God's people as they take up their ministry. But the one thing that the church should not do is to take away the hot potato of God's calling that he has placed in our hearts. It's not good for the church, it's not good for the individual parishioner, and most importantly, it's not good for the needs of the world. What is good is when we seek God's calling on our lives and respond in faith. For it is God who works in you to will and to act according to his good purposes. Friends, what calling has God placed on your heart? What needs of the world is he moving you to address? May God give you ears to hear and a heart to respond, that the needs of the world might be met, and you in turn might be blessed in your calling. My friends, may God bless you, and we look forward to seeing you on Sunday.